Hello, my name is Bob. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to use layer mats to isolate specific areas of an image so you can apply grades and other effects to just those parts of the image. Now before we start, I should warn you that I cover quite a lot in this tutorial, so it's probably worth watching it a few times to make sure you don't miss anything. Okay, I'm going to start off by adding a basic look to this shot. This is a base grade I saved earlier from a reference shot. It should work as a good starting point for this shot. Now I'll open up the Baselight user interface for this clip by going into the Effects mode and clicking on Baselight in the Effect Editor window. I'll also maximize it to full screen. So let's have a look at this shot with the base grade applied. If I open up the Layer Manager, you can see that it has three layers. The first layer is applying a log C to video curve to bring the raw footage into a more useful range for grading. And the next two layers set an initial contrast and colour balance to the shot. Okay, now I want to start working on the details. First, I want to bring more attention to her face by adding some additional brightness to the highlights. I'm going to isolate the highlighted areas on her face using a key. Baselight provides three different keyers. They work in different ways, and to a certain extent the best way to figure out which key is the right one to use is to try them all out. With experience you get a feel for what might work best in any situation, but it's always worth having a bit of a play if you have time. In this case, I'm going to use the matte RGB keyer. As its name implies, this works by selecting pixels which fall within a specified range of RGB values. Now before I do anything else, I need to add a new layer, or I'll end up adding a matte to the current layer, which is being used to set part of the overall look. So I'll press P on the keyboard to add a new layer. To enable the key, we first need to switch over to the Matte Operators panel by clicking on the Matte button here. I can now click on the Matte RGB button in the left column to enable the keyer. Alternatively, you can just press R on the keyboard. As soon as I enable the keyer, its name turned blue, indicating that it's now active, and the other keyers are no longer available in this column. You may have noticed that the reference button up here also turned blue. The reference is used to select the image which the key is actually going to be pulled from. You may have thought that the keyer will simply operate on the image we see at this point in the stack, but actually by default the key will be pulled from the raw image. The reason for this is that if we were to go back and change the grades in any of the layers before the keyer, then the key would change and we'd end up having to set it up all over again. If I click on the reference button, you can see that there are several different places where we can pull the key from, including the output of the previous layer, which is what we see here at the moment. In this case, I'm actually going to choose the output of layer 1. I know I won't be changing layer 1 as it's providing that conversion from log C to video, and I think it may be easier to pull a nice key off the converted image rather than the flat raw image. So I want to select just the highlights on this model's face. I'll go back to the matte RGB controls and then hide the matte operator buttons. To set up the keyer, I'll make sure that the Pick from Source button is enabled and then simply left click and drag across the lighter parts of her face. Up here, you can see the RGB ranges which have been selected, and you can view the matte by pressing O on the keyboard. I can now make some adjustments by dragging on these RGB ranges, or by using the knobs on the artist color. You can also drag on the sliders in the UI, and if there's a wheel on your mouse, you can use it to adjust the controls by placing the cursor over the slider and rotating the wheel. At the moment, the three RGB controls are moving together as they're currently ganged, but by toggling these buttons off, we can adjust them separately. I set up this keyer initially by dragging on the image, but I could also have used one of these presets. Many of the operators in Baselight have presets which you can use as a starting point. It's also possible to save your own presets. Okay, so we have a matte which appears to be selecting the highlights. I can overlay this on the image by pressing Shift-O on the keyboard. As you can see, it also covers parts of the hair and hand. I could make some more adjustments to the RGB sliders to try and select just the highlights on her face, but in this case I don't mind adding a bit of a highlight to the hair as well. I just didn't want to affect the eyes or the mouth. However, I do want to restrict the effect to the area just centered around the face. So I'm going to combine this key with a shape. I enable the shape operator by clicking on it here in the left column, above the keyer. At this point I'm not using any of the operators in the right hand column. We'll come on to those later. With the shape operator selected, I'm going to draw a simple ellipse around her face by selecting Ellipse from the New Curve Mode button. Now, I simply click and drag on the image from the center of the ellipse outward. As soon as I let go of the mouse button, the shape is created and cuts off the parts of the key which were outside the ellipse. We can also use shapes in this way as garbage mats by drawing freehand shapes around just the parts of the image that we want to be included in the mat. Later on, I'll show you how you can use the shapes themselves to create a mat. Now, as you can see, the edge of the shape is rather hard, and this isn't going to look good as a highlight on the image, so I need to soften the edge by feathering the shape. As I increase the feather radius, you can see the ellipse softening, but as the feathering is going outwards from the shape, it's also making the overall shape bigger. I therefore need to shrink the shape, which I can do either by dragging on one of these blue corner handles, or by using the right hand trackball on the artist colour. There's an awful lot more you can do with shapes, such as adding extra curves, variable feathering and so on, and this is all covered in the shapes tutorial on our website. Okay, so we now have a mat which will restrict our grade to the right parts of the image, but the edge of the key is still too hard, so I'm going to use the Matte tool to soften the key. First, I need to make sure that the key is selected here, as the Matte tool is always applied to the current operator. Now I click on this button. The Matte tool consists of a series of steps which allow you to process the mat using a range of tools, to fill holes, to expand or contract the mat, or to soften the edges. These are all covered in more detail in the Matte tool tutorial on our website. In this case, I'm just going to use a simple blur to soften the key. First, I'll turn off extended ranges, as we only need to add a small amount of blur. And now I'm using the knobs on the artist colour to adjust the softness of the key. Right, this looks like it might work. So let's switch back to the image, that's O on the keyboard, and select the grading operators panel, either by clicking on this button or by pressing G on the keyboard. I'm going to select the film grade and then use the artist colour to increase the exposure and also the contrast of the highlights in her face. If I toggle this layer on and off using Command F11 on the keyboard, you can now see the effect this layer is having. Well, that looks okay on this frame, so let's check what it looks like when we play it back. I don't have to go back to the Avid timeline to play back if I just want to view this shot. I simply press the spacebar and the shot starts to loop in the Baselight viewer. I can also expand the image display to fill the screen by pressing F8. Incidentally, the playback is nice and smooth on this machine, but unfortunately my screen recorder can't keep up with the full frame rate, so it's dropping frames. You'll also probably notice some noise and banding in the image. Unfortunately, that's due to the compression that we have to apply to get these tutorials onto the web. Now you'll notice immediately that she moves her head and that the ellipse we made just stays in one place. So what we need to do is to animate the shape. I'll scrub down to the first frame of the shot and reposition the shape, using the middle ball of the artist colour. You can also move shapes by dragging on their middle blue handle with the mouse. I'll add a keyframe to the shape's position by clicking on this button and set the interpolation mode to smooth. Now I'll scrub along to the last frame and reposition the shape again. This has automatically added a new keyframe at the end of the shot. Now I'll go back to the first frame and step forward using the right arrow on the keyboard to see how well the motion tracks. Well, at this point the shape's a little bit off where we want it to be, so I'll reposition it, which adds another keyframe, and then we'll carry on stepping through the rest of the shot. Okay, I've added a couple more keyframes, so let's go back to the beginning and play through that and see how it looks. Well, the shape seems to track pretty well. I'll press G on the keyboard to switch back to the grade operators, which will hide the shape outline. Yep, that looks fine. If I really needed to, I could also keyframe the shape's rotation and scale, and even animate individual points on its circumference to dynamically alter the shape throughout the shot. The motion in this shot is pretty simple, so adding a few keyframes was all we needed to do to track it. However, sometimes you need to track much more complex moves, which would need many more keyframes. In these cases, it may be better to use Baselight's built-in auto tracker to generate the keyframes for you. I'll be covering that in another tutorial. So I've now added a lighting effect to our original base grade by combining a key with an animated shape to create a matte for this layer, which isolates and tracks the highlights on the face. I've been using the keyboard shortcut O to view the matte, but I can also do that by clicking on the render button below the viewer and selecting Layer Matte. This shows the complete matte for this layer. If I want to look at each of the matte elements separately, I can choose Selection Output instead. This will show me only what I currently have selected, in other words, whatever controls are currently visible here. This is useful as it allows me to go back and adjust each element separately. For example, I may want to tweak the key without having the blur added to it. If the key doesn't seem to be behaving properly, I can select the reference button, which shows me the image which the key is being pulled from. In this case, it's the output of my log C to video layer at the top of the stack. I can also bypass individual elements by clicking on the B button up here. For example, I can temporarily disable the shape in order to view the whole of the key. I'll re-enable the shape and then return to the layer output. Okay, I now have a nice highlight effect on the model's face. In part 2 of this tutorial, I'll show you how to use the other keys to further enhance the image and how to create more complex mattes.